All right, thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Welcome board members, members of the public, DOJ staff, to the third policy subcommittee meeting of the year. I'm going to have us jump right into, well, actually, I'm calling this meeting to order, so make sure that's clear. I'm going to have us jump into introductions. My name is John Dobard. I'm Vice President of Policy and Programs at Catalyst California and an appointee of Speaker Emeritus Anthony Rendon. And I will pass it to Board Member Cosby.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amina Kazi, she, her pronouns, and I am a civil rights attorney based in Southern California, and I am an appointee of the California Attorney General's office, and I will pass it to Board Member Diallo.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Souley Diallo. I'm a supervising deputy public defender for the Riverside County Public Defender's Office, a board member of the California Public Defenders Association, and an appointee of the CPDA to this body. And with that, I will turn it over to Board Member Randolph.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everyone. My name is Rich Randolph. I am a representative for California PORAC, and I'm Police Chief, Fontana Unified School District. And I will pass it off to, I don't see anyone. My next, Miss Kalkami.
Yes, hi, thanks.
Yes.
Manjusha Kulkarni, Executive Director of API Equity Alliance, co-founder of Stop API Hate, she, her, hers, and I'm a designee of Speaker Emeritus Anthony Rendon.
Do we have any other board members joining us?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wade Ford, pastor at the 16th Street St. David's Church in San Bernardino, California, appointee of Attorney General Bob Bonta.
Welcome. Any other board members? All right, hearing none, I'm going to move us along here and transition us to approval of the meeting minutes from May 22nd. Board members, please take some time to review if you haven't already done so, and when ready, I invite a motion to approve.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Great. So hearing that we have a motion on the table to approve the minutes as written, I can go ahead and begin with a roll call vote, but board members, I do want to let you know that we also have Co-Chair Andrea Guerrero, who has now joined the meeting as well. So moving into the roll call vote for the motion to approve the minutes as written, Member Diallo?
As I was unfortunately absent, I will be abstaining from the minute.
Member Diallo abstains. Member Dobard?
Aye.
Member Dobard votes aye. Member Ford?
I'm new. I don't think I was at that meeting, so I as well have to abstain.
Okay. Member Ford abstains. Member Guerrero?
My understanding is we could still approve even if we weren't present. DOJ, yeah, okay, so I approve.
Member Guerrero votes aye. Member Kulkarni?
How do we select?
Aye.
Member Kulkarni votes aye. And I'm sorry, it sounded like somebody was asking a question. Just wanted to leave the opportunity for them to do so. Okay, hearing none. Member Causey?
Aye.
Member Causey votes aye. And Member Randolph?
I was not present, so I will respectfully bypass.
Okay, Member Randolph abstains. And the motion carries with 4 ayes and 3 abstentions. And the minutes are so approved.
Great. All right. Thank you. So I'm going to move us along here. Next, we have updates from the DOJ on the updated draft. So I will turn it over to DOJ to provide us with those updates, and that'll be followed by a discussion.
Hello, everyone. I will share my screen. This is something of an introduction to the policy section. The policy section, as you've all seen, is quite lengthy. This is only sort of a snapshot of it. We were given sort of limited time. And I'll mention that I cannot, while presenting in presentation mode, I cannot see if anyone has a question. So feel free to just speak out if you would like to stop me. But there will be time at the end for questions as well. I should perhaps start with my name and introduction. My name is Dr. Eric Van Holm. I'm a Research Data Specialist 3 with Research Services at the Department of Justice, and I'm the lead researcher on the RIPA project. Although I work with an outstanding team that helped prepare the analyses that I'm excited to share with you today. Today, I'm going to give something of a focused presentation covering some of the specific requests from the board in this committee for this year's report. The board at large requested many things, but within the policy section, we're looking at 3 broad questions clustered around sort of public safety. The sort of 3 broad questions, disparities within agencies. How do disparities differ across stops and actions? And what do different types of searches with regards to consent and other distinctions look like? And so with those questions posed, we developed analytical strategies to try and answer those questions. We'll cover each of these analyses in this presentation, although in sort of a limited form. We could do an hour on all of these questions. We'll first look at how stops and outcomes differ between agencies as a result of agency and regional characteristics. Secondly, we'll look at pretextual stops and how whether there were changes in LA and San Francisco after new policies were introduced to limit those. And finally, we'll explore potential disparities across demographic groups for stops and actions. Although in this presentation, we'll focus on disparities in search. And this is a real subset of the analyses that were conducted. And so with limited time, jumping right in. The agency analysis is one of the larger pieces of analysis we completed this year. RIPA data is collected at the individual stop level, but we aggregated that data to the agency level to understand how agency characteristics and regional characteristics impact some outcomes of interest. And we did 7 separate analyses looking at 7 different outcomes, which were chosen both because of public interest and sort of in the interest of space. These were sort of chosen and reviewed and proposed from the beginning. Others could potentially be added if that is of the board's interest, although with limited time and space, these are what have been conducted so far. The first 3 of these 7 are looking at race and looking at the differences in the share of stops for perceived white individuals, perceived Black individuals, and perceived Hispanic individuals compared to those county populations that the agencies reside in. We would expect that in counties with a larger share of white individuals that there will be more stops of white individuals. But by anchoring this to the county population for those groups, we can see where those disparities grow or shrink and indicate how agency and regional characteristics affect those. We also looked at 4 outcomes or occurrences within stops, the percentage of stops in an arrest for each agency, the percentage of stops with at least 1 action, percentage of stops with consent-only search, and the percentage of stops with limited force used. In the interest of time for today's presentation, I'll only be presenting on those 3 race analyses, although in the future and in the policy document, there is all 7 analyses currently. And so with this slide, I'll go through 3 sets of the race-related outcomes, but first I map them at the to show the trend at the county level. So aggregating agencies to counties to look across counties at how these different outcomes appear. First, we see how those perceived as being white are stopped at a higher rate. And I know that this map is somewhat small. I have a map over my desk with all of the county names. I'm sure everyone wants me to call out the county that they reside in, but there isn't going to be time for that, of course. But we can see from this where at the county level agencies collectively are stopping white and perceived individuals at a rate that exceeds their county population, and also where they are stopped at a lower rate than their county population would predict. And so at the highest rates of Lassen and Alpine County in Northern California, stop whites at roughly 10% more than their county population is in those counties. And at the other end, Marin and Inyo have a lower share of stops of white individuals than their county population would predict. The second map looks at the same type of data for perceived Black individuals. And we can see across the state that stops of Black individuals tend to exceed the county populations of Black individuals. The Bay Area in particular, collectively, but Alameda, Contra Costa, Solano, and extending out to Sacramento, which I'm aware is not part of the Bay Area, but it's close. Those have rates that across the state exceed the county populations at a higher rate. The lowest is Lassen, which is the only county where agencies collectively stop Black people, have a lower share of stops of perceived Black individuals than their county population. And finally, we can see these rates for Hispanic, Latinx groups. And we see sort of the regional pattern that is different for each group. For Hispanic or Latinx individuals, they are stopped at the highest rate in Santa Clara, or the rate that they are stopped most highly exceeds their county population, while Lassen and Colusa and counties in the far north of California have the lowest, have the most underrepresentation of Hispanics amongst their stop shares. And so this is kind of the outcome of interest, or one outcome of interest that we looked at, although we looked at it sort of at the agency level in our actual analyses. And so here we're going to look at the regression results seeking to explain those differences across agencies, not collectively for counties, but looking at agencies individually. And for each agency, we tried to understand how agency characteristics and regional characteristics impacted, in this case, the difference between the county population of a given race and their share of stops of that same racial group. And on the table, you can see listed the variables that were used. And with the regression analysis, what we can do is change one variable at a time and compare agencies that are the same on other qualities, but looking at what impact one characteristic has individually. So these first 4 variables that we included and look at are agency type. And each of these are compared to sheriff's offices. And so for the police row, it is looking at for an agency that is in the same, has the same regional characteristics, the same type of county, the same size of department. If it is a police department versus a sheriff's department, what is the ratio of stops for white individuals? What is the ratio of stops for Black individuals? Looking at it across that. I thought somebody might be ready to speak up. The second variable that we looked at is the size of agencies, looking at the sort of total size collectively. And those are the 2 things that we were able to look at for agency characteristics, size and type of agency. For regional characteristics, we included 4 variables for the regional populations for 4 racial groups: white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian. We also looked at the county population in terms of how large is the county, what is the total population, as well as the county median income, which is a general measure of county wealth. And so for median income and population, what we're looking at is a 1 unit increase in either of those measures. How does more higher median income, how does a larger population affect these outcomes? And finally, what is the type of county? And so is it part of a metropolitan area? Is it part of a micropolitan statistical area, which is, for anyone that isn't aware, is something sort of between a metropolitan statistical area and a rural area. And so for a micropolitan or a micropolitan area, those are compared to metro. And so if the county with the same regional characteristics and the same type of agency, how does changing that one characteristic affect the outcome? And so we're going to look at these 3 ratios one by one. First, looking at the ratio, the share of stops of white individuals compared to the county population of white individuals. And there's a lot of numbers on the table. Everyone should feel free to look at all of them, but I want to try and sort of focus the attention, right? These cells are going to be colored based on the direction of that variable. And so blue is indicating a negative relationship, red will indicate a positive relationship. And I'm only highlighting those variables that we describe as statistically significant, that we can say with statistical confidence are different than 0, although all of the coefficients are shown. And so in the case of the stops of white individuals, in agencies that are police departments, they tend to stop a lower share of white individuals than the county population of white individuals would predict on its own. Sorry, I paused there. I could hear an echo of myself. But to say that again, for agencies that are police departments, they tend to stop a slightly lower share of white individuals than their county populations would predict than sheriff's departments. Or you could say the reverse, sheriff's departments tend to stop a slightly higher percentage of white individuals than police departments do. Similarly, K-12 schools also stop a lower share of white individuals or have stops of white individuals at a lower rate than their county population would predict compared to sheriff's departments. K-12 schools are obviously kind of a difficult measure in this because a school's population is going to differ from its county's population, but the result is still, I think, of some interest. And so in the case of looking at the ratio of white stops to white county population, those are the only 2 variables that are statistically significant. Looking at the percentage of stops of Black perceived individuals compared to the Black population in those same counties that the agencies reside in, we see different relationships. Police departments tend to stop a higher ratio of Black individuals than the county population would predict compared to sheriff's departments. Similarly, K-12 schools and colleges, which again have the same problems of what's the population, but they both tend to stop a higher share of Black individuals, Black perceived individuals than their Black county population would predict. The larger departments, regardless of agency type, tend to stop a larger share of Black individuals than their county population would predict. In counties with a larger share of Black individuals, as measured by the percentage Black perceived individuals tend to be even more overrepresented amongst those stops. Although that has only sort of limited statistical strength to it. Similarly, county median income, while we're not as confident in that statistical result, counties with a higher median income tend to see a greater share of Blacks perceived individuals stopped than other counties. And finally, we look at the results for Hispanic perceived individuals. Similarly to the ratio for Black, Hispanic individuals tend to make up a larger share of stops than the county population would predict, a larger share of that for police departments. Whereas colleges, the relationship is the opposite. Colleges tend to stop a smaller share of Hispanic population than would be predicted by their county population. And finally, it's not the strongest result, but micropolitan statistical areas, an agency in a micropolitan statistical area tends to stop a smaller share of Hispanic perceived individuals than the county population would predict. As I said, this is only one set of three sets of the 7 analyses we did. They're all in the policy document. And I have given almost the entire time that I was allotted to that. And so it is a lot to go through. And we look forward to feedback, but I must continue moving because we have even more analyses to tell you all about. Now move to a review of the analysis of pretextual stops. We conducted an analysis of 2 cities or departments, I'll use that interchangeably, that enacted policy changes. Los Angeles did so in 2022. San Francisco PD did so in 2024. And so we used the longitudinal nature of RIPA that has been collected over many years to see if there was a visible change after those policies were enacted. And so first we look at the impact of the LAPD's policy that was enacted in 2022. You can see the arrow pointing to the start of that pretext policy. And here we look, and in that policy, it states that officers should only make stops for minor equipment violations or other infractions, only when the officer believes that such a violation or infraction significantly interferes with public safety. And so that's verbiage to describe what they were trying to remove as pretextual stop, that those stops should only occur if there is actually a public danger created. And so here we show both moving and non-moving violations that occurred before and after the policy. Moving refers to such acts as speeding and reckless driving. And while there are changes month to month shown on the blue line, you can see that it's an overall flat trend across the 4 years included here. But for non-moving violations, which refers to vehicle maintenance or operations, such as an expired registration, there is a noticeable decrease. And that decrease began before the policy began, likely while it was being discussed, although it declined across all of 2021. But that decline has been maintained since the pretext policy began and has been consistent across those years. The SFPD policy covered 9 specific categories of violations, and police department personnel were instructed to not stop or detain a vehicle based on one or more of those acts. And there are 9 specific acts, such as an expired registration, a rear brake light, an unclear license plate, no lighting on the license plate. As shown, these stops make up a small portion of the 27,000 stops that SFPD had in 2024, at least. But the policy is relatively new, so there's less time to sort of observe the effects of it, unlike the LAPD, where we can see the sort of maintained effect. Those 9 categories were getting used more often sort of immediately before the policy. In kind of contrast to LAPD, where there had already sort of been a decline, it seems that they were being used more commonly in early 2024. But there has been sort of a reversion to sort of prior months the rest of the year. And, you know, in future years, if it's warranted, we can continue to review the changes and see if how those changes are maintained. So finally, we look at, and this is just going to be a handful of analyses that were requested. We were given a lot of, there were many different sort of types of analyses that were sort of interest with new variables coming in. We were given these 8 different sort of lines of inquiry. I'm only going to be able to look at a subset of 2, given the time that we have. But in a future meeting, you know, we'd be happy to go into greater depths about all of these. But today I'll just have time to sort of look at sort of stuff related to consent type and consent searches. So first, we look at 3 broad types of consent that can be given, and these are broken down by gender, implied, verbal, or written. Verbal consent is far and away the most common form of consent, although differences exist across the genders. Implied consent was used in a larger percentage of stops for non-binary or transgender individuals, perceived individuals, than it was for those that were perceived as being cisgender. Written consent was used in 1.5% of stops for transgender men and boys, although the percentage of transgender women and non-binary persons were lower than those for perceived as being cisgender. Here we move to another disparity related to search, this time focusing on discovery rates broken down by different types of basis. In the graph, we have 4 categories: other non-discretionary basis, other discretionary basis, consent-only basis, and consent and basis for search. For the non-discretionary and the other discretionary, the denominator is a searched person that consent is not the basis. And for consent only, the person was searched and consent was the only basis. And for consent and other, the person was searched and consent and another basis was used for search. And so each of these, to some degree, cover a different type of stop, but we can see the sort of relative use of them across stops. And the graph is displaying here the discovery rates broken down by language fluency, which we highlight because of the disparities present. And so those with limited or no English frequency had a very high discovery rate for other and non-discretionary basis searches, almost double that for those who are English fluent. Which stands out considering the relative differences in other types of consent. For consent and basis for search, the difference in discovery rate is only 0.3%. These are relatively muted, except in the case of other non-discretionary basis. And this is the final slide for this presentation. Again, displaying differences in consent search rate by perceived English fluency. And the categories, the colors are the same. The non-discretionary and the other discretionary, the denominator is a search person where consent is not the basis. And again, those with limited or no English are more likely to have other and non-discretionary basis, which refers to an incident to arrest, a search warrant, or a vehicle inventory as a really specific sort of set of searches that are non-discretionary, non-consent. Whereas those that are perceived as being fluent in English are more likely to have non-consenting searches occur on a discretionary basis. And whereas for those searches which occur with consent, we see relatively muted changes again. And so it's these other basis of searches that are really standing out as being distinct based on English fluency. And so this is just a snippet of the types of disparities that are captured in the policy report based on your requests. And so I know that I've already taken 7 more minutes than I was allotted, but I am happy to take any questions or go into more detail about anything that I've shared. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, let's open it up. Co-Chair Guerrero.
Hi, thank you, Eric. A couple of thoughts on your agency analysis. I wonder
Yes.
if we could, if you could come up with a better title for the graph that was showing percent stops versus percent of population, because you were using different language to describe it, which made sense to me, but it didn't square with the title. So I think more clarity in that title about what that is showing. On the regression analysis, we talked about this at the Stop Data Committee, but just making sure that there's a preface to the use of regression analysis about why we use it, what it's for, what it tells us. And then, you know, I mean, I took statistics a long time ago. It was hard for me to understand. And like the 1 unit increase, I didn't understand at all. And I don't know if other people will have trouble understanding what that means or what we're comparing against. Yeah, and then, yeah, just we're gonna need like descriptors of all these things, like the consent search one. We have other discretionary, other non-discretionary, like, yeah, we're gonna need text to figure out what that means. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Board Member Randolph.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. I just had a couple questions for you. On the agency analysis, K through 12 meetings, are you throwing in all the K through 12 police departments? Is that what that's supposed to mean? Okay, so
Yes.
the other one, you also talked about the colleges. Is that colleges broken down? Is that going to be JC2, the 2-year universities and the Cal States? You throw them all
Yes.
together? Because I think they should be. I mean, I'm glad Miss Andrea talked about, further clarification. We're throwing them all together. That should be clarified. Other agency types. What's an other agency type? If I'm a member of the public, I'm thinking, I know what an other agency type is. And Andrea's nodding her head. Yes, LAX, housing authority, transportation
Courts.
police. But if you're throwing them all together, I think that should be clarified. And then unique officers. What's a unique officer?
So a unique officer, so taking, for this analysis, it's looking at the number of unique officer IDs reporting data to RIPA as a sort of measure of sort of the size of each department, how many unique officers they have working.
Okay, so that's more confusing for me. I'm thinking unique officer is a railroad police officer or a postal police officer. That you threw out unique officer, so maybe it's unique officer specific to an assignment, like a med officer, someone who's assigned to a gang task force. Can you, if you're going to dive into these breakdowns, they should be broken down further for the public to also digest that.
Okay, thank you. Noted.
And then the last one on the disparities, you talked about disparities and additional data to be pulled because certain questions people wanted. How do you guys determine that? If I'm just a member of the public and I reach out to DOJ, hey, I want you guys to pull this data as well. How do you determine what data is to be analyzed to be thrown in this report? Just curious.
Primarily we are responsive to the board and your requests, and we work with CREST to determine. These aren't public requests that we're.
Okay.
These are primarily requests that come from you that are often filtered through the staff at CREST that we come together to figure out what is going into all of the analyses and sections.
Thank you so much for answering that. Thank you so much, Chairman Dobar.
Thank you. Co-Chair Guerrero. Is that an old hand or okay? Not a new hand. One other question on the pretext policy chart that you showed, is that intended to? So I know in the current draft, there's a chart on monthly stops, and then there's a note saying new chart pending from research services. Is the chart that you just showed, which isn't monthly, it looks yearly, is that intended to be in that section or is that going in another section?
We're still working through exactly what we want to go into that section.
Okay.
The actual analysis is sort of comparing like a limited number of months to keep the sort of seasonality limited. And that I think these probably won't be the final graphs that go in, but the analysis will sort of say the same trends.
Got it. Thank you. Any other questions from board members at this time? Board Member Cosby.
Yeah, on I forget the number of the slide. It's where it talks about implied consent, written consent, or verbal consent. What is the definition of implied consent that you're using?
So that's coming from one of the columns it's coming out of the basis for consent columns in the RIPA data. But I don't have the README open to know exactly how we, but implied is, as I understand it, refers to something like nodding, that the officer is receiving not a verbal yes or no, but is receiving implied consent that they are taking to continue the stop or continue the search.
Okay, I can definitely look that up too. Thanks for pointing out where that was taken from. And just, I think it's really great. And I also just wanted to say I really appreciated the maps at the beginning with the kind of the lavender, the white to the all the way up to the red. I think that's like a really great way to visually depict the differences and representations with the population. So I really appreciated those maps.
Okay, so in terms of actionable next steps, I heard some recommendations on adding descriptors for the regression analysis, adding some clarification points on some of the pieces that Board Member Randolph raised.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Granholm? Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And let me see, for DOJ, any additional updates?
Yes, we're going to walk the subcommittee through the working draft. Give us just a second to get set up and share screen.
All right.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Janelle Orozco Alcala. I am a Deputy Attorney General with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section of the Department of Justice. And just like we did during the May subcommittee, my colleague Shannon and I are going to walk all of you through the working draft of the policies chapter for the 2026 RIPA report. And then we'll turn the floor back to all of you to discuss and give us feedback on the draft as it exists right now. Before we get started and walk through it, I would like to encourage all of you to consider possible policy recommendations that the subcommittee may wish to include at the end of this section. For your consideration, we do have a few policy recommendations that can be found at the end of the full report. I believe those are pages 64 through 65. Sorry, let me back up. And what you're looking at right now is a shell of the working draft because the draft is just so large. So we thought that this would be easier for all of you to follow. So I'll now start us off by walking us through the first half of the draft section. Starting off with the introduction. The introduction is section 1, and it can be found on page 1 of the draft. The introduction starts by noting that despite a decade of analysis and recommendations by the RIPA board, the data reported still continues to reflect disparities in the treatment of different communities. And then the introduction gives the roadmap for the rest of this chapter. Shannon and I will go in through each subsection in more detail, but I'll just give you all a broad general overview. First, the policy section will examine the link between racial and identity profiling by law enforcement and public safety, concluding that reducing or eliminating this type of profiling ultimately improves public safety. The chapter then provides an analysis of 2 common policing practices. This is pretextual stops and oversaturation policing. The section on pretextual stops discusses a number of studies acknowledging the impacts of pretextual stops on public safety. The section on oversaturation policing discusses the origins and impacts of the practice and also includes a section on alternative enforcement technologies and their connection to racial and identity profiling. And then the chapter transitions into an analysis of the 2024 RIPA data. That section was just covered by Eric. Much of that content was, so we will not be reviewing that further with you all. And then finally, the chapter would conclude with any policy recommendations that you all may wish to include. So let's now get started on looking at section 2. So this section is titled Racial and Identity Profiling is a Public Safety Issue. And this can be found on pages 1 through 12 of the larger draft that was shared with you all. First, in this section, we have a brief introduction that notes that as spending on law enforcement and the criminal legal system have generally continued to increase, so does police interaction with residents in select neighborhoods that are over-policed. This section then highlights some factors that contribute to public safety. This is section 2A. Thank you, Yasi. And this section was informed by the robust conversation that you all had during the May subcommittee meeting around the factors that contribute to public safety, as well as research by our team. In this section, we note that public safety includes the collective experience of being safeguarded or protected from threats to one's well-being. We then will move on to section 2B. This section examines the impact. So having defined public safety, go ahead. Co-Chair Guerrero, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering if the definition for public safety is being drawn from somewhere or if that is being proposed as a definition. If you could clarify, that'd be great.
Thank you. So I think the direct quote comes from the previous meeting in May. We will make that more clear. As you can imagine, we had a lot of folks drafting this section, so I'll pause for a second to see if someone else in our team has a direct answer to that. But I do believe that it was language borrowed from the May meeting, and we will be sure to clarify that in the next version of the draft.
Just to confirm, I believe that is correct. That the language, the definition itself was proposed in the May subcommittee meeting. And I'm sorry, it sounds like someone else was about to speak. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought perhaps Co-Chair Dobard was going to speak to that. I think it's tracked. The proposed definition is tracked in the subcommittee meeting minutes from the most recent subcommittee meeting. And that is a proposal to move to the full board.
Yeah, so just to confirm that, Co-Chair Guerrero, we ended up, DOJ came to us in the May meeting saying they needed guidance on a definition, so we discussed that. And so what they have there tracks with our conversation.
Thank you, everyone. So let's move on to section 2B. This section examines the impacts. So again, first we define public safety, and then we discuss the impacts of racial and identity profiling on public safety. In this section, we highlight that racial and identity profiling have serious public health consequences, can undermine trust in law enforcement, and reduce civic engagement, all of which can ultimately weaken public safety. Research in this section shows that negative encounters with law enforcement, and this is both direct or vicarious encounters, can fuel distrust in law enforcement, can impair communication with police, and can lead to a general reluctance to seek help or cooperate in police investigations. Higher levels of distrust may also result in decreased willingness to engage with public institutions. This includes things like serving on jury or voting. Research in this area has also shown that residents who reported lower civic engagement unfortunately also reported feeling that their communities are less safe. Then we transition into a discussion on the public health impacts of racial and identity profiling. And for folks that are following along, this is on page 5. Looks like we have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Hello. Thank you so much, Board Member Randolph. On those last 3 statements there, are we going to cite those quotes or source that? Where's that's coming from?
Yes, so I'm giving a broad overview
Okay.
In the working draft. You will see footnotes with links, and so all of that should be things that you can click on and review.
Perfect. Thank you.
Janelle, you're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, everyone. Moving back to the public health impact section, this is at the top of page 5. The research in this section shows that experiencing persistent police practices, such as police stops at a higher rate or instances of use of force, is also linked to symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, distress, and unfortunately also suicide attempts. And again, all of this is a broad overview. There are footnotes in the working draft that support these assertions. And then this section also highlights work that the board has done in the past by noting that researchers have found that the public health of adolescents and young adults in particular is affected by negative police encounters. And we note that this was discussed more fully in last year's RIPA report. And then we move into section 2C, the economic costs of racial and identity profiling. This section examines the financial costs of police interactions and contacts with the criminal legal system on individuals and communities. Some research in this area has shown that individuals with stigmatized characteristics, such as a criminal record, may encounter significant barriers to employment, even if they otherwise have desirable traits or the experience necessary for the job. One study found that an arrest in adolescence increased the likelihood of being arrested later in young adulthood. And in turn, young adults with an arrest history were at greater risk for unemployment and more likely to be dependent on public assistance later on in life. As you can see, this section also explores the steady rise in law enforcement budgets. And lastly, this section will note that although police departments sometimes pay settlements and judgments stemming from impermissible practices such as profiling, these settlements themselves rarely lead to reform. And that takes us through the first half. I will now stop to see if there are any additional questions before my colleague Shannon takes over. And then as you discussed, if you have any questions, we are happy to answer those. Thank you all.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shannon Kitten. I am also an attorney with the Civil Rights Enforcement section, and I will be handling the second half of the policies report. Yasi, if you could stop the screen share, I'm going to take over. And hopefully everyone can now see the outline that we have now. I'm going to move on to section 3, which is eliminating pretextual stops improves public safety. This section is broken down into 2 parts. One is general research and data that talks about pretextual stops in general. And then the second is expanding on prior board discussions of specific jurisdictions that have made efforts to reduce or eliminate pretextual stops and what the numbers, what the data show from those specific jurisdictions. So when we go to section A1, we talk about the specific statistics that we are seeing within the data subset of consent searches. So we're looking at traffic stops, and particularly I'd like to look at data between traffic stop consent searches of moving and non-moving violations, because you can really see a disparate impact, not only with the individuals who are asked to be searched, but as well as discovery rates. And data services covered a lot of that in the beginning, but we're interested in having some additional charts that break that down further. And then the second subset of this is an area that we haven't discussed much yet in some of the prior RIPA reports, which is direct and indirect deadly police interactions. So the first part of this subset talks mainly about the risk to officer, the risk to motorist or individual pulled over, specifically when it comes to shootings. And then the second part of this was raised by Board Member Smith of specifically wanting to look into the impacts and the disparities in high-speed chases. And so within this section, we look at high-speed chases and the limited data that we can find from CHP reporting that goes out to the legislature every year, and then beginning to look at the RIPA data when we look at evading stops and to see if there are racially disparate statistics and numbers that we can glean from not just the impact on the individuals who are a part of the chase, being law enforcement or the individual driver, but also whether or not there's disparate impacts in the community in which these high-speed chases end, because they may start in one location and can go into numerous different areas. So that is subset A2. The second part of the pretextual stop section talks about the specific jurisdictions that have made changes to their pretextual stop policies. And we discussed, and I believe it was March or May, Fayetteville, North Carolina. The reason that was selected is because it was really the first large-scale reduction in pretextual stop policies that also has a significant data point and individual or specific data analyses that have been conducted since to show whether or not there were impacts, what the impacts were, and how the policies implicated not just traffic statistics, but also community engagement. And I know that Board Member Guerrero has had interest in us explaining that a little bit more in the report, so that introduction has been added. The second jurisdiction that we look at was originated in the 2023 RIPA report, and that was when we first introduced Virginia's statewide limitation on pretextual stops. Now, Virginia was selected in 2023 because, as I said, it was the first state to put a limitation on pretextual stops. Now we have additional data that we can pull in and discuss, and there was a specific agency within Virginia who's done some data analysis that we go into in further detail in section B2 of the report. And then finally, the real large part of the data that we can pull on that is very applicable to RIPA and to California is Los Angeles's pretextual limitation policy that went into effect in March of 2022. Board Member Dobard, you specifically asked whether or not the chart that talked about the new changes by month in the pretext stops was going to be included in this section of the pretextual report. It is. It will replace the 2024 data that we saw in the 2024 RIPA report. So really the idea of this section is to expand on this discussion to say, you know, we began talking about this several years ago, but now we really have the data to look at how these limitations have impacted the nature of the stops that we're seeing. And what you could see from that that report that was shared by data services is there is a reduction, as you can see, and I can put this into the screen, hopefully everyone can see that. There is a reduction, particularly when it comes to non-moving violations, and even some reduction at times with moving violations, but really what the biggest impact was that reduction in non-moving violations. I also want to compare that as well to pretextual stop limitations when it comes to consent searches, because the consent searches as a result of pretextual stop limitations also reduced. Then there are several additional jurisdictions in California that have made reductions in their pretextual stop policies or made limitations. Berkeley, San Francisco. San Francisco has more limited data, so that is something that I would continue to leave up to the board as to whether or not the board wants to go into San Francisco more at this time with the limited data that we have from San Francisco. But then we also have in the beginning of the jurisdictional area chart that talks about just throughout the country all of the steps that have been taken through various jurisdictions, whether it be police agencies, district attorneys, states, local jurisdictions, to limit policy or to create policies limiting pretextual stops. So that is the pretextual stop section. I'll pause right here if anyone has any specific questions to pretextual stops before I move on to oversaturation policing. And I see Board Member Guerrero, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I have a few things here. So one is, and I sent DOJ staff this directly already, but it would be really important to have additional data visualizations for consent searches as a percentage of overall searches. You have it currently as consent searches over stops. And that's, I mean, I suppose that's helpful, but it's the scale of the searches to the stops is problematic, right? So I think what we really want to understand is how reliant are law enforcement on consent as consent only as a basis for the search. So that would be great to see. Consent search as a percent, consent only search as a percent of all searches. That's something that would be helpful to policymakers and the general public. The other comment I have is on vehicle chases. I was glad to see that put in there. I think it would be important to just inform and remind the public about the relevant laws relating to vehicle pursuits, because vehicle pursuits are a form of use of force, and we have laws in the books about them, and I didn't see that in there, and I think that's important context to provide. I'm glad to hear that you're going to put in some context, lay the groundwork for why we are looking outside of California at Fayetteville and Virginia, and I look forward to seeing that language. With regard to Los Angeles, your data on pretext, the start of the pretext policy, I think it would be helpful to recognize either in the data or in the text that we were coming out of COVID in March 2022, like literally, my kid was just starting to go back to school. So data that's like from a few months before or even 2 years before is going to be colored by that landscape fact. So it would be nice to see like some longer back, like what did it look like, 5 years back? What did it look like 10 years back? I'm not sure how you would do that, but at a minimum, just some sort of recognition that like the world was not normal at the start of that policy. And so comparing the month before and the month after is like colored by that landscape change. And then lastly, with regard to consent searches, we have in previous reports talked about the CHP policy as an example of a consent policy that leads to very low consent only searches. And I think it's worth lifting up the Oakland Police Department, which has, or the San Francisco Police Department, for their policies. Those are police department policies. The Oakland one is old, it's from 2004. The San Francisco one is newer. You do touch on San Francisco policy for pretext stops, but for Oakland, they only 1% of their searches are consent only based, as opposed to say 54% or higher for other agencies in the state. So I think it's worth noting them and their policy. All of these policies are now online, and I think that's a good reference point for the public.
I agree with all of those. I think part of the consent searches, and can you see the outline?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to highlight, I think, whoops, I just closed it down. I think the area where we're going to be getting into a lot of the consent search general data is where I have highlighted on, it's now currently section V, and at the end of this, I'll talk about some reorganization ideas, but I think the idea is to get into the consent searches in the analysis of the 2024 RIPA data. So my anticipation is that's where a lot of that information will be plugged into.
You're talking about a whole year from now. Is that right?
I'm talking about the discussion of consent searches and policies. My understanding is that it's going to go into what is currently section V, which is analysis of 2024 RIPA data.
The data that was, the data that we are analyzing right now.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I mentioned this in the Stop Data Committee. I just want to make sure that across all the places where consent data is being represented in the different sections of the report, that we are using a denominator that is searches, because that is more relevant to understanding the impact of consent-only searches, which are discretionary for the public.
Understood. And I think Chief Randolph, you had some questions as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Shanna. I'm glad you dove right in here. I just wanted to bring to this committee's attention because we have new committee members, and I have spoken about this before. When we start comparing other states, I strongly want this board to consider, this panel to consider, when we're comparing other states, that our level of training in the state of California surpasses that of Virginia and North Carolina. And when we're starting to compare about numbers, and I've cautioned the board so we can maintain credibility with members of the assembly who actually get this report, that's something we should take in consideration. So I'm looking at 20 weeks in Virginia and North Carolina, while ours is 26 weeks, and we actually do target racial profiling in both of our academies, or I'm sorry, all of our academies. And the other thing, since we are talking about data, I also was hoping we could look into the crime increases, or where the crime index is for those states after they had passed these particular laws, because I'm seeing significant increases in both Virginia and North Carolina. And then the last thing I just wanted to cite here, Shannon, I'm glad I see you, it's missing now. Can you scroll down with the LPR? There we go. The cost of surveillance policing are increasing, but such increases have not led to a reduction in racial identity profiling or an increase in public safety. How are we sourcing that data?
I'm getting to that next, although I don't know that I can answer that specific question, but I was just handling so far the pretextual stops, and then I'm going to move on to oversaturation.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And I know I'll have to look into more for your question with respect to crime index. The specific rate of crashes and crime for Fayetteville from 2013 to 2016 was addressed in a study that is cited in this report that did cite a reduction not only in crime during that period, but also vehicular crashes and serious injury in those crashes. I cannot specifically answer that for Virginia yet, though, so I'll look at it and make sure that that is addressed.
I greatly appreciate that. And since we are starting to talk about pursuits and race, first of all, for someone who's been in vehicle pursuits, I'm not going to know 9 times out of 10, I'm not going to know the ethnicity of the driver, no matter what, especially at night. And I do speak for the peace officers in this state. But the big one is, if we're going to start tracking data like that, the state pursuit form for the California Highway Patrol, which is required form, has the ethnicity. So if we're going to start throwing that data out, I think we should probably cross-reference that as well, because that form is completed at the termination of a pursuit.
And I do discuss that in that section of the report. So I referenced the CHP data. The interesting aspect of that is, though the data is collected through CHP when it comes to racial and identity makeup of the drivers, as well as time of day, lighting conditions. That information is not included in the yearly reports to the legislature. So I do think that's an interesting area of discussion for this board in terms of the data sets, both with RIPA and the CHP data, and how the two can be used, married up, or analyzed together. But I appreciate you mentioning that. And it looks like Pastor Ford.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with one of the things that was mentioned by, I'm not sure if it's Officer Randolph. I want to say it correctly, sir. I want to just understand the value as it pertains to, what was that, North Carolina and Virginia? Were those baselines to see the pretextual stop transitions, the shift in the trajectory, or are those truly to be comparative? Because I could understand the concern, right? There's so many different variables that are so significantly different between those East Coast states compared to Cali. You know, I mean, it's an extreme difference. So I just wanted to kind of understand where you saw value in those particular states as it pertains to the potential stops.
I think it's a great question, and I think it can be both, right? I mean, one of the best aspects of Fayetteville is it was really the first movement. Fayetteville was, and both Fayetteville as well as Virginia also had data requirements during that period. So while there are significantly different variables in terms of the location, the training, there are similarities as well, right? And you know, as a trial lawyer, we talk about weight versus admissibility, right, in evidence that comes before it. I think having the information present for everyone to say, you know, here's really the first step. This was the first thing that was done in Fayetteville. They used data to not only create the policy, to discover where the issues were, but then they had data tracking throughout the 2013 to 2016 time that it was in use. And then there were subsequent studies that were conducted by researchers, not, you know, related to anyone actually within Fayetteville, that had independent analysis of the impacts of these studies. So the reason that Fayetteville was really the first, and it's when you do a lot of research in pretextual stops, it's why it's talked about the most, is because everyone's kind of looked at it because it was the first big effort. And so, you know, often we can learn a lot from the first time something has taken flight. With respect to Virginia, that again is because it was a statewide limitation, which was similar to what the board called for in the 2023 RIPA report. So I think that was really the impetus by choosing Virginia, was to say, look, other states have done this. Let's see, you know, how this is going to play out. Let's see what the numbers look like. Let's see if there's things that we can learn, both positive or negative, from Virginia taking the lead with that sort of legislation. And I hope I answered your question there.
No, you did. I mean, I was just trying to understand if it was a comparative value versus one of learning, where principles could possibly be universal principles. You know, having spent time in Fayetteville and having spent time all over the state of Virginia, California is just so different. And so that's what I was just kind of understanding, what was the goal, and using those. Were they baselines? Were they just kind of, you know, as time went on, these are the trajectory of outcomes as it pertained to these transitions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you for answering that question.
Of course. Any other questions before I move on to oversaturation policing? Okay, so the next section, and the last section that we're going to cover this afternoon, talks about the deployment of alternative enforcement technologies in oversaturation policing. So we talk very broadly and generally about the board's definition of public safety, how the particular marginalized communities react to oversaturation policing, some of the forms of saturation policing, and the overall impact that it has on community well-being. Then the second part of this section talks about specific alternative enforcement technologies. There is a large chart in this section that goes through a number of different technologies that we discuss. This section of the report, we are looking to kind of tighten up more, to take some more out. So I think that the current form of where it is now is likely to be condensed and reduced. However, the specific areas of enforcement technologies that we get into, aside from just mentioning them in a chart, is facial recognition technology, gunshot detection, and predictive policing as subsets to alternative enforcement technologies. And then one of the larger areas that we talk about with oversaturation policing is the ALPR data, which is otherwise known as license plate reader data, and then how that intersects with the local creation and holding of this data with federal requests for that information, be it in federal prosecution or immigration purposes. And so I know that's likely to be a very prescient topic as we move forward. I know it's likely to be discussed in the upcoming board hearing. That's something that I think the intention right now of what was discussed at some of the prior board hearings was to begin the conversation about this information and this data. And then likely next year, we will have a lot more specific data points that we can analyze. But the intention right now is setting up that discussion. And then finally, we have a section that talks about the costs of some of the surveillance policing and considering that cost in terms of a cost benefit analysis of whether or not we have a reduction in racial and identity profiling, or whether or not it can pinpoint to specific reductions in discoveries of crime and crime statistics. So now I will open this section up for questions. And Chief Randolph, with your question, I do not currently have the answer to that. If anyone else from the team who's worked on that specific section, and if you could say your question again too, to remind us.
Sure. So the statement is the cost of surveillance policing are increasing, but such increases have not led to a reduction in racial identity profiling or an increase in public safety. That's a strong statement. And I'm going to continue to track that statement all the way to the board. So I just want to know where this was sourced and what data we have to back that up.
And there are specific citations within the report. I did not work on this particular section, so I cannot tell you off the top of my head where a lot of this is sourced from. And then that is definitely something that we can follow up with. But there are citations within that section to where the information is pulled from. Sorry, I can't answer it more specifically.
And I can provide some more information. I didn't draft the section myself, but have been working closely with our team member that did. Like Shannon said, there are citations throughout. What I can tell you, Board Member Randolph, is that we just hitting my inbox a couple of weeks ago was an updated long list of more current data on police expenditures from 2020 and beyond, looking specifically at California. I think one of the examples that we have here that I can just point you to is on page 46. I think TASER offered the city of San Diego a 5-year body camera contract for $267,000. This section highlights that there is the initial investment cost and then costs also associated with storage and data maintenance. So at the end, the total cost was $3.6 million, pardon me. What I will say is that as this draft has progressed and taken shape, so has the content and the connections that we're needing to make under each section. So we will certainly make sure that there are direct citations to some of the evidence, which right now shows that there's conflicting evidence on the effectiveness of some of these technologies, and that sometimes the algorithm that is fed into these technologies already relies on some biases.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I'm greatly appreciative of that. But I am aware that the expenditures have went up. As a police chief, I could say it has went up statewide because I do hear about it from all the other chiefs. And a lot of it also is attributed to basically maintaining our databases and uploading and feeding the Department of Justice to maintain our RIPA follow through. That is one issue that has came up as far as personnel and manpower. But the statement that I'm most concerned about, and I want this board to look at is that racial profiling is still not declining. And I just cannot believe that based on the fact that the RIPA has still been here and there is changes going on in the state. It kind of makes it look like we're not doing our job as a board. And I think I know that's not the case. So if we're going to throw those statements out, I want to make sure that we have backing on that level.
And I think that's a good point. That's something that I talk about a lot in the pretextual stop section, which is, and you can see that within the Los Angeles changes to their pretextual stop policy, is that though they did see some reductions in racial profiling, generally what we're seeing with these pretextual stop policies is there's calls for more, right? We're seeing reductions, but in order to get more reductions, we need to do X, Y, and Z. The last part of what we are here to talk about with the report is a very important section, which is the policy recommendations by this board. In bold are the 3 potential policy recommendations as discussed in previous subcommittee meetings. I did add in the non-bolded the specific language from the 2023 report that talked about pretextual stops. So I did want to include that to the board today, but this is obviously a very important aspect that we would like the board's feedback and discussion on, and how we want to craft, how the board wants to craft the recommendations for this year's report. The last part that I would like to discuss with the board is possible movement of our report this year. We've gone through how the report is set up now, but we are discussing changing the organization of the report. And what we're suggesting, and we would like the board's input on, is we would be starting with analyses of the 2024 data, which is kind of how you saw the presentation today, right? Let's start with the data. Let's talk about what the data shows, and then from that move into policy ideas. So it would start with 2024 data, and then from there, we would get into some of the specific areas that we would be talking about policy changes. And so this is a mock-up of what the new structure would look like. So it would start out with the 2024 data, and then it would move into oversaturation policing and talk about general oversaturation policing. And then from oversaturation policing, we would talk about pretextual stops, which I think many have argued that pretextual stops are a form of oversaturation policing. So we would be narrowing down the subject matter. And then finally, once we've talked about specific tactics that harm community, we would talk about general racial and identity profiling as a public safety issue. So this is our proposed change to the organization of the current outlay of the policies report, and we would love to hear the board's thoughts on that as well. And thank you everyone very much for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, thank you. A lot to jump into and not much time. So I'm going to hand it to my co-chair, Co-Chair Guerrero, to lead the board through a discussion of the updated draft.
Thanks, John. Well, thank you for the DOJ report. I think you put some questions to us. One is on the organization of the report, and on the recommendations. Those were the 2 things that I think we really need to prioritize. But I wanted to just first open it up to see if there are board members with comments that haven't already been shared about the report, and then we'll talk about those 2 questions. Okay, hearing none.
Yes.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So, one comment to share, and I think this might be in line a bit with what Board Member Randolph was mentioning, his last comment. But I in the section, law enforcement budgets have increased, but those increases are not correlated to an increase in public safety. So currently page 9 of the report, recommendation to DOJ to, I see citations. All right, I see a citation most of this is on funding, but there's one line in there that increases in funding have not significantly correlated to a reduction in crime. And then the citation is a New York Times article. I'm good with the Times article being in there, but want to strongly encourage DOJ to look for research, like more reliable research that can be cited to substantiate that claim.
Thank you, John. Did you have more to add, comments on the report? And of
I
course,
do, but other things I think can be shared. I can share them with DOJ staff through notes and send them there. But that was one that jumped out to me that I think is important for DOJ.
Okay, great. And yeah, I just want to, remind both the board and the public that you are always at any time welcome to write your suggestions to the DOJ staff directly. Board Member Ford.
Thank you for taking, acknowledging my hand. Question kind of back to officer, forgive me again, should I say officer, help me so I say it right?
Pastor, I'm here as a member of the board, but I am a police chief, but I'll go with officer because I started as an officer and I am a police officer.
Chief Randolph. It's okay. Chief. So I guess, and you all have to help me. I'm a little bit new. I am pretty excited about the opportunity, so I hope my questions don't sound impetuous, but I am curious as to, before it goes to the next level, before all this data is taken to the next level, verifying the sourcing portion, right? So if the initial sourcing and the post sourcing are the same, I don't know, the avenues or whatever the way that it was accomplished, if those are the same, then it seems like the information should be credible, even if it is uncomfortable. And so just wondering, is that indeed the case? And if we're not sure in this moment, can that information be ascertained before this is taken to, I'm not sure, whatever the next steps of the conversation are?
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Ford. The next step is a full board meeting where the report will be largely done. The committees will have done their work. We'll be bringing all the parts together into a whole for what is essentially a final review. So DOJ staff, is absorbing our comments and our input right now to create the next iteration of the draft that will go to the full board. And our charge is to look over the policy section. Thank you for your comments and your input. Are there other board members who want to provide any general comments before we dive in on structure and recommendations?
I have a couple.
Okay, sorry, I'm sorry if I missed your hand. Is that?
This is Amina, board member.
Okay, yeah. Yes. I am looking.
No worries. I'll be very quick.
There you are.
Yeah, I'll be very quick just to reinforce some of what's been said as well. So I also noted on page 9 that, we make that big statement that there hasn't been correlation and an increase in public safety. And I do think that needs to be backed up with some examples. Throughout, I think it would be nice if we could find more California examples. So on page 10, as an example, we talk about payouts to different lawsuits and civil suits in different states. It would be really nice to see if we can provide some California examples, because I do agree, like, we've been doing this for 10 years. It would be nice to see, have we made any improvements? Do we have anything to show for it? Even if we have further to go, which I think we would all acknowledge we can do better, but how do things heavily look? So kind of California examples, and if there's like a way to show any longitudinal growth or deficits as well. And then my major comment that I don't think that has been mentioned yet is when we talk often about pretextual stops, I think in the report, we are equating pretextual stops as a shorthand, when I really think we need to be more specific and say low-level traffic offenses or non-safety related traffic stops, because if we say that this law was enacted on pretextual stops, well, really that law didn't have to, or policy didn't have to deal with pretextual stops, because as it says in the report, it's kind of hard to tell what exactly was a pretextual stop. You know, officers are not required to, you know, report on their intent, you know, behind a stop. But I think we need to be a little bit more specific and say there has been like a decrease in non-safety related traffic stops instead of saying pretextual stops. For example, I think that was on page 21 in the big bold heading. So that those are my few comments.
Thank you so much. And I'm seeing 4 screens, so I'm flipping through. Please speak up if you are a board member and you have additional comments. Yes, John.
One more, and just want to echo the suggestion around more California examples, particularly the one on page 10, but that wasn't why I raised my hand. I want to note that on page 11, and it seems like there's a recommendation embedded in there, and I just want to call that out to see if we need to make that part of the recommendation section. So there, it says municipalities should consider financial policies that encourage accountability from law enforcement agencies as a means of addressing police misconduct and advancing community safety. It's not hyper specific, but it does read to me as a recommendation that is not at the end. And so just want to uplift that and see if that needs to be part of our conversation around the recommendations.
Great. Okay, any other general thoughts before we dive in to structure and recs?
I do have a very general comment. I kind of see, I don't know, a disparity in between 2 sections of the policies draft regarding, say, the pretextual stops and, you know, to the extent we dive into consent issues regarding consent, which have specific recommendations which are database and very linked, versus the section that deals with kind of oversaturation policing, which raises some interesting questions, and, you know, does have citations which kind of raise some questions as to a certain amount of these procedures and technologies. Questions that I have myself as a criminal defense attorney, but I just don't find them as narrowly tailored towards disparities that this committee really specifically addresses. So to the extent that, you know, oversaturation deals with a number of different policing issues, very broad. I think we should be careful in terms of how specific our policy recommendations would be in that area, as contrasted to what I see as more narrowly tailored data-based policy recommendations in the sphere of pretextual stops and consent searches.
Thank you. All right, Board Member Diallo has given us something to think about. Anyone else? Okay, let's jump into the question around structure. The DOJ staff is suggesting a restructure. Does anyone have any input on that?
I'll jump in. I mean, generally, I like the proposal. I like the idea of starting with analysis and then going into the other policy related issues. The only thing that I am still processing is whether the pretextual policy piece should follow the oversaturation piece, but I get the rationale. I'm just sitting with that. But generally I'm good with the proposal.
Okay, thank you. Any other input on that proposed structure? Okay. Yeah, I would echo John. I don't have any concerns about it. I agree, starting with data is always a good place to start. So, all right, let's move on then to to the recommendations. And there were a couple of recommendations listed in the draft report. They are listed at page 65 of the draft. And the first recommendation is that the legislature enact legislation similar to policies in place in North Carolina, San Francisco, West Hollywood, Los Angeles, and Virginia, and prohibit pretextual stops, and enact legislation limiting stops only to specified offenses considered to impact public safety. I wasn't at the last committee meeting, so I understand there was some conversation already about what the shape of the recommendation should be. But is there any input on that recommendation?
Co-Chair Guerrero, I can share my screen to show the recommendations if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. Thank you. And please speak up if I can't see you across my multiple screens. I guess I do have a recommendation or a suggestion for this recommendation, which is that that the audience for it be local policymakers, or local governments, as well as the legislature, because I know there is a lot of movement at the local level. So that would be a suggestion I would make for this.
I agree with that suggestion. Also, just want to clarify, we actually didn't discuss any recommendations at that time. We didn't have any at that time.
Okay.
So these are new in this space.
Okay. All right. Well, I think as a matter of practice, well, DOJ, can you let us know, do we need to take any votes on these, or you're just still collecting input?
At this point, we don't need a vote. We're still collecting input, and there will be an opportunity for you to vote as members of the full board on whether to support the recommendations as they're drafted in the report. So now is essentially the time to discuss if you would like to see any changes to the language of the recommendations before we move that over to the full board.
Got it. Okay. All right. So then we have a second recommendation which is there on the screen. The legislature should enact legislation to prohibit or limit policing practices that rely on oversaturation of marginalized communities due to the negative effects of those practices on those communities. Here too, I would consider directing this to both local policymakers as well as the legislature, because there is conversation at the local level. Any thoughts on this recommendation?
This is Board Member Kazi. Just the language oversaturation of marginalized communities. I think we're missing some words in that phrase. It's saying we don't want marginalized communities to be saturated, where I think we don't want the police to be saturated in oversaturated in those communities.
Right, good point. It's the oversaturation of policing practices, or something better that's more clear. Any other input?
I agree with both of those.
Okay, anything else? All right, we'll move on to the third recommendation, that the legislature should enact legislation to study and make further recommendations limiting the use of alternative enforcement technologies, such as face recognition, gunshot detection, and predictive policing technology, if the use of such technologies exacerbates existing bias or be deployed in oversaturation policing. On this one, my my thought is this is more of like a budget ask, not really a legislative ask. I suppose it could be a legislative ask, but really something that should be directed to the governor to allocate resources for such a thing. It could be the governor and the legislature. That's my only thought there. Other input?
This is Board Member Kazi. My input, well, first of all, my recommendation that's helped me to view as many board members as possible is if you click on view and then prioritize video, you get everyone who's got their video on the first page. That's just a tip for anyone who needs that. I would really like to see us use the word prohibit or recommendations prohibiting or limiting. I think we need to live in a world where we can prohibit some of these technologies, and it also mirrors the language in the first and second recommendations.
Thank you, Board Member Kazi. Any additional input?
I don't know how to exactly phrase this, but just looking at recommendation 3, kind of echoing some of my concerns in terms of number 3 encompasses a broad range of different law enforcement techniques, and because it's such a broad category, I fear that, because it's a study and make further recommendations limiting before kind of, I think, the data is specific enough for us to make such a recommendation. I would prefer language to talk about studying these technologies, and to the extent that they exacerbate existing bias or are deployed in oversaturation, consider their limitation and or prohibition, instead of presuming that at the onset, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think I share your concern, and I appreciate you raising it.
Ms. Andrea, if I can, I just want to echo what my board member colleague just mentioned. I totally agree with what he is saying. I think this is, once again, this is no offense to anyone on this board. I think this is another broad overreach for the RIPA board for us. Technologies such as gunshot detection and facial recognition, I don't understand how that could be attributed to racial profiling. And yes, if we're going to throw something like that, I think the verbiage needs to be modified because people read this report and they think it is gospel. And I really want to make sure we maintain credibility with people.
So we've heard a few comments about concerns about jumping into recommendations for legislation ahead, combining like a recommendation for both study and legislation without understanding what a study would deliver to us in terms of information and data that could be the basis for a recommendation. Is that right, Board Member Diallo, and is that, and you've made a suggestion that this be narrowed down to a study to understand these technologies and their potential impact. Is that right? Or
it's actually stated much more succinctly than I did. Yes. I mean, I'm open to language that, talks about potentially, limiting these technologies, but not ahead of the studies.
Mm-hmm.
That's my concern. I think we should always have a data-driven approach, and especially because of the broad nature of some of these technologies, which some of them more concerns than others, kind of categorizing them and leading with limiting or prohibition without first having the data, I think, weakens that recommendation.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around that? Board Member Kazi.
Yes, in my opinion, I think the report as written does a good job. explaining the pros and cons of these technologies and how they have led or exacerbated issues of racial profiling, such as the facial recognition technology and how it misreads, especially women of color. I feel like there are examples of that throughout this report. And so I would feel comfortable with this recommendation as written. Again, I would like to see the word prohibit, but I think, you know, if we were to do a study of California technologies, when like this could be years down the road before we are recommending the legislature to take any action. So I would feel comfortable based on all the research that has been offered in this report of making this recommendation.
So if I may offer, I think the recommendation as written is trying to do two things, and there's some concern about, you know, if what the recommendation is currently saying is we need more study on this, these are evolving technologies, then that could be a standalone recommendation. The addition of, you know, limiting or prohibiting the technology based on what's already in the report, that cuts against the need for more studies. So I think we need to have a better understanding of what we're prepared to do based on the report as written. Does the report offer enough about these evolving technologies to make recommendations, or do we need more study? I think the tension is that it's trying to do both those things right now. I welcome any input on that.
One of my concerns is also the contrast. You know, when we have a strong recommendation, like in recommendation policy number 1, which I actually am supportive of and I think is well backed by the data, making kind of a direct recommendation, very specific such as that, I think maybe undermined when we make a kind of a recommendation in a similar vein that's not as tethered to specific examples and data as in number 1, for example. So I would hate to undermine that when, and again, I know Board Member Kazi mentioned, for example, facial recognition and some of the issues with that are referenced in the report, which I've studied that, and I definitely agree with some of the problem is you're dealing with disparate technologies that are, you know, have very, you know, different assessments depending upon who you talk to and are preliminary in terms of their data. I think that's, especially when you're lumping them all together. Predictive policing technology, for example, I can imagine very different perspectives on what, first of all, what that means and what the impact of it is depending upon its use. But lumping all of these together, I think calls for us to be very circumspect in terms of specific recommendations that get ahead of the data.
Yeah, other thoughts about that? Yeah, I agree. I think that that the technology that is covered in this recommendation is 1, it's evolving. 2, it's we haven't done enough legwork to really do the kind of detailed recommendations. I would love to see like more. I would love to see number 3, you know, broken down into, you know, recommendations about each of these things. I don't know if we have enough to do that. or if what we need is in fact study on these evolving technologies. I would be supportive of a recommendation to ask the governor and the legislature to allocate part of the budget to getting that information so that we have more to work with. And then making, data-driven recommendations in a future year. I should note that this is, I believe, the first time that we're introducing a conversation about these technologies in this report. And so I think it was important that we do so because it's becoming pretty critical to what's going on out there in the world, and I could see it as a jumping off point for further research and discussion in the coming year's report. For all those reasons, I would support Board Member Diallo's suggestion that we focus in on allocating resources to a study of this technology to better understand and have public attention pointing towards the potential impact of the technology.
This is Board Member Kazi. I could support that as well. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And I think we're kind of headed in the right direction. And I think you're right. It's just a question of, are we there yet or not? And I appreciate the expertise that some of you have cited on, the studies that have been done. So I'm not going to argue the opposite point. I can see that.
Okay, and then thank you, Board Member Kazi. Board Member Dobard, you had raised a question about whether some language in the report should be elevated to a recommendation. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I just want to propose that we do consider that as a recommendation, and it would be also helpful for DOJ to provide some examples of what some of those financial policies could be. So that's the gist of it.
Okay, and so if I recall, it was the text in the language was about, did you want to?
Yeah, so I'll restate it. So it's on page 11. It's in the context of law enforcement paying settlements and judgments and the relationship between that and whether we see misconduct actually decrease. And so it's in that context. The language is municipalities should consider financial policies that encourage accountability from law enforcement agencies as a means of addressing police misconduct and advancing community safety. I'm not doing any wordsmithing right now. I'm just saying the main point of this recommendation, that's what I'd like us to consider. And then have DOJ also provide us with some examples of what particular financial policies could be.
Right. And so the question, I guess, for DOJ to consider is whether at this point in the year, because we're only one step before reviewing a final, whether we have, I mean, sort of related to the last question, do we know enough? Do we have enough in the way of examples or, to base a recommendation off of? Because this language is still pretty general, and I'm not sure, like, if I turn to my local city, if they would know what to do with a recommendation like that. So I'm as offering a friendly suggestion to your suggestion, which would be potentially to make this also a part of our next year focus. Just given the where we are in the year, but if DOJ thinks they could do something with that, I'd love to hear from them. DOJ staff, do you want to chime in here? Or better yet, maybe I'm just looking at the clock and we haven't had any public comment yet. So how about DOJ Digest? And I want to capture any final board member comment before I pitch it back to John for public comment and closing.
This is Board Member Kazi. Have we had prior reports recommendations on consent searches? I still am concerned about
Yes.
thank you, and the implied consent issue. I just took a brief look at the 2023 REPA key. You know, officers are not asked to input whether it's discretionary, non-discretionary, implied verbal or written. There's just values for 0 or 1 for consent. So I'm really wondering where that comes from, and if we should, you know, just having officers interpreting consent is concerning for me. And so I just wanted to ask if we could look into that a bit more, if that hasn't been addressed in prior recommendations.
Yeah, DOJ could further elucidate.
Sorry, Board Member Guerrero, this is Board Member Kajabi. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to join until late, although I've heard I came around at 3:15. I just wanted to add to that, because these are new data sets, we haven't in the past been able to look at verbal versus written versus implied. And I want to wholeheartedly endorse the idea that consent continue to be one of the themes we look at. And in particular, the law enforcement's going to the work of collecting this data, that we take advantage of looking at those specific categories. So without talking about that in more detail, but just Board Member Kazi, thank you for raising that. This is the first year where there's data with those different categories under consent.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's right. So it sounds like there's need for clarity from DOJ staff in the report on how we're capturing that information about consent, and we have made recommendations in the past about consent searches, strong recommendations several years in a row. I believe the last several years, 3 years running. And so I would just point you to those reports, Board Member Kazi. I'll turn it back to you, John, for public comment, and if we could move quickly through as much as we can. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So at this time, the public is welcome to address the subcommittee for up to 2 minutes. Under the Bagley-Keene Act, neither board members nor DOJ staff are required to respond to public comment, but can choose to provide a brief response. You can submit public comment by raising your hand in the app, unmuting yourself if you're on the phone, or alternatively submitting public comment after the meeting by emailing ab953@doj.ca.gov. All right, and we will start with Northern California. Anyone from Northern California? Anyone from Central California? Okay, let's go to Southern California, and we will start with you, Michelle.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me? Great, great. I did put my comment in the chat, but I revised it a bit. The California law enforcement agencies have endorsed AB 284. It would amend AB 953 to ensure that data analyses are rigorous, fair, and useful for improving police practices. For example, AB 284 proposes that analyses distinguish discretionary from non-discretionary stops. It defines non-discretionary stops as calls for service, whereby officers have no choice but to respond. Unfortunately, AB 284 proposes eliminating data collection of non-discretionary stops. I disagree. Instead, I'm in support of revising this draft outline to incorporate separate analyses of discretionary versus non-discretionary stops. The current draft appears not to include such analyses. However, Mr. Von Helm's PowerPoint today uses the terms discretionary versus non-discretionary, but it's not clear whether this is defined as specified by AB 284. Fortunately, DOJ staff in this meeting suggested that a revised draft outline would be used to rewrite the relevant section of the draft. I support revising that section to report analyses separately by discretionary versus non-discretionary stops. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public from Southern California? No? Okay. Oh. Yasmin, did you want to jump in here?
I apologize, that was an error.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay. So thank you to the members of the public that did chime in. And thank you to DOJ staff for the updated draft and appreciate the robust discussion we had today. There are some next steps for DOJ staff. So things that were mentioned included adding descriptors on the regression analysis, providing some clarifying language on things like agency type and unique officer. We have some requests to explore what could be done with this recommendation about financial policies that discourage police misconduct. And then we should see some revisions to the recommendations language, which we'll see in an updated draft. And then folks are good with the revision in terms of structure or the restructure of the draft. So we should all anticipate seeing that revised structure in an updated draft. Right. I think that is it. And to be clear, DOJ staff, we do not need a motion to adjourn, correct?
That's correct. No motion to adjourn. And just to confirm, we will work on the revisions that you all have put forward for us today. And you should expect to see most, if not all of those revisions by the October 16th full board meeting. If any board members have any further edits that they would like to see to the policies draft, please do submit those to the AB 953 inbox or to myself or Alexander Simpson by email. And the sooner the better so that we can get those incorporated and send out to you ahead of the October 16th board meeting.
Okay, thank you. And just for the good of the order, let me ask any final comments or questions from any board members before we adjourn? Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.